We're really lucky tonight to have Matthew Solomon, the filmmaker, with us in the house tonight. And we have an amazing group of panelists. And I also just want to really recognize, because I know many of you in the audience, that there are so many of you in the audience that could easily have been part of our panel of experts. So I just really encourage you to look around, meet the people that are in front of you and behind you and around you, because this is our community and these are the people who care about the same things, right? Of making a difference and trying to make change, positive change in our community. And also I want to point out that Matthew created this film on his iPhone. So every one of you has the capability of being an activist with what's in your pocket, right? We all have a way to be able to let our voices be heard. So I think we don't have to be perfect to be change makers. We just have to really care, and we have to talk to each other, and we have to learn as we go along. I want to introduce you to my son, Nigel Ousey. When he was 12, he joined an activism camp called Yay Camp, and they teach young people how to understand about social change and activism. And when Nigel was done, he wasn't going to hand out flyers or volunteer in an organization, which was what I thought he would do. He was like, no, Mom, I'm starting my own nonprofit and I'm going to make the world safer for Black and brown people. So he's 15 now, and he has his own nonprofit. He has his own radio show on G-Town Radio. He recently interviewed Cornel West. He's doing video interviews, and this is his first major event. So welcome, Nigel Ousey.
I'm Nigel, obviously. Thanks for being here. I'm a bit nervous, so I'm going to keep this paper. I wouldn't have even thought of having an event like this if it weren't for the incredible team of people who helped me make this happen. I want to thank Matthew Solomon for creating this. He put a lot of thought and hard work into this. I want to thank Tom Casetta, the station manager, because I want to thank the Falzer Club for letting us have this venue. I want to thank Carolyn and Steve Fillmore, because they are probably the only reason why this has been so successful so far.
Oh, yay! Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you.
They also run a grassroots community newspaper based in Germantown. And I want to thank my mom who helped me put all of this together, not just the event.
Yeah!
I started my nonprofit, See Beyond My Skin, to fight racism through community action. And one person saying they're gonna make a change is nothing. When a community of people come together and say, this needs to change, that's when real change happens. And young people have grown into a system which they have not created, and a system that unjustifiably puts them down for things that they cannot change. I believe that to really change, to change policing for the better, you need to remake the system from the ground up, because you cannot make a foundation off of slaves. You cannot make a foundation off of racism and institutionalized bigotry, and have a system that is not bigoted towards minority groups.
Thank you. I wonder if anybody else on the panel would just like to share a brief reaction to the film and what we just watched.
It's very easy to complain, but it's harder to find solutions for that. And I found that the best part of the film, in looking at ways to how to deal with it constructively. So I really want to thank the filmmaker, because it dealt with some, putting out the problems are more important than looking at the solutions. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
I want to thank Matthew also, because I think it's critical not just nationally on what's going on, but also locally here in Philadelphia. We just had an election for a mayoral race, and we had a person that ran, a black woman, that ran on stop and frisk, and people were very surprised when I came out publicly and endorsed the Republican. And the reason why I did that was because I decided not to go party, but to go policy, right? We had her run on stop and frisk. She's talking about bringing the National Guard in to militarize the city. She's talking about hiring more police. She said nothing about investing in the communities that have been disinvested in. She said nothing about making sure that the evidence-based practices that we have instituted here in Philadelphia that has decreased violence. She has not talked about investing in any of that. That is terrifying to me as a person who works every day with young people to keep them safe, to keep them from going to the carceral and the cemetery. So thank you so much, Matthew, because it didn't just focus on the issues that we're experiencing nationally, it focused on what we're going through right here and now in Philadelphia.
Thank you.
To kind of piggyback off of what Movita said, since the 1970s, cities have been investing between 15 and 45% of their police budget, of their city budget, on policing. So on materials, on training, on overtime. In Philadelphia, we have a poverty rate of 23%. And in some parts of Philly, especially North Philly, the poverty rate is up to 45%, and that affects specifically Latino and then Black Philadelphians. So to think about the need for reinvestment and to descale how much is invested in police is highly important. I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Menika.
You know, it only seems surprising what you said if we assume that the police just exist to make everyone safe. But this, of course, is an incredibly naive and inaccurate way of understanding the role of policing. So you asked, how did we get here? Well, policing exists to make systems of exploitation possible. And they emerge as a force about 200 years ago in direct relationship of the dominant systems of exploitation at that time. Colonialism, mass industrialization, and slavery. And almost every police force you can find in the world developed in direct relation to one or more of those three things. Today, we ask, well then why do we have African American and female politicians in Chicago and Philadelphia saying the solution to our problems are more police? Well, because they're caught up in the system of exploitation that we have today, right? We don't have slavery and colonialism in that 19th century sense anymore. We barely have industrialization in the US, right? What we have is neoliberal austerity. This use of government to push wealth up the economic ladder in hopes that a few already very successful people will become so competitive on the global stage and so incredibly wealthy that some of that wealth will magically trickle down to the rest of them, right, to the rest of us. So we subsidize the billionaire owners of Amazon. We subsidize Elon Musk and his factories in upstate New York where people are living in dire poverty, but he is a billionaire wasting his money trying to fly to Mars. Policing makes that possible. Because to do that pushing up of wealth, we got to cut services, we cut taxes for the rich, we don't have any money to pay for basic things, and we skew employment markets, we create economic precarity for people. So instead of policing slave revolts and resistance to colonialism, police are micromanaging the losers in that arrangement. The folks who don't have access to mental health services, the folks who don't have access to drug treatment services, kids who don't see an economic future for themselves. So these politicians do not have a plan to fix the schools. They do not have a plan to put our young people to work. They do not have a plan to solve the homelessness crisis. They do not have a plan to provide mental health and substance abuse services. So they need police. It's essential to their whole political purpose is to say, because I do not have a solution to any of these problems, what I have is police to put a lid on it, to make it possible for those systems of exploitation to just keep chugging right along, pushing that wealth up the ladder at the expense of the rest of us.
Thank you.
If you're an everyday person, they're not interested in listening to your solution because they're scared that you're going to break the system, right? So we often say, you know, the system's broken and it needs to be fixed. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly how it was intended to work, right? So that's why we have to continue to organize. We have to continue to show this film. We have to continue to push this agenda because our children's lives depend on it. Our communities depend on it. You know, the status quo can't continue to be the status quo. It's not acceptable.
So I'm really glad to be on this panel because in many ways I've been thinking about all of these topics and in some cases thinking that my belief that our society, especially major cities, have turned into focusing on crime as an industry as being a conspiracy theory, but I don't think it is. Like, I mean, I would say like the tough on crime era of the 1960s and onward, it coincided with not just the civil rights movement and protests, but also desegregation and deindustrialization, job flight, white flight, black migration from the south to the north, and also the decline in the city tax base. And the fact that cities needed money to pay for police, fire, streets, snow removal, schools, public housing, and having all of these middle class and upper class people leave urban cities and jobs and industries, there has to be someone to pick up the slack. And by investing in police who are going to handle crime is what has become the way to maintain a new middle class that will pay taxes. So not just police, but also lawyers, funeral directors, hospital workers, doctors, nurses, anyone that helps facilitate the carceral system has become the new middle and upper class that is feeding our tax base. So if cities like Philadelphia cater to that middle class, they're able to garner more tax base. And just thinking about Philly today, like from the 1970s onward, there's been drastic investment in the police and prisons and the carceral system. And the 1970s, when that actually happens around like 1976, Frank Rizzo, who was police commissioner turned mayor, was in office. So he kick-started this heavily support initiative to invest in police and the carceral system. And it's also during his administration as mayor that you have police garnering paid overtime, something that was established in the 60s in Philadelphia and blew up in the 70s to the point where Philadelphia Inquirer journalists are doing investigations about misconduct, including police brutality and corruption, and also expenses of overtime just exceeding the budget for the city every year. So I'm sure all of us know about Michael Chitwood, who was in Philadelphia, police officer. Yeah, he started as a police officer in Philly, 1970s. He was a detective, and he later became police superintendent in Upper Darby, and he retired not long ago. When he was a detective in the 1970s in Philly, he was making nearly twice his salary as a police officer. His salary competed with the police commissioner in the 1970s because he worked so much overtime. And there was no cap on overtime in Philadelphia. And even today, overtime has no cap, and we're paying for it. The city spends over $13 million on overtime, police overtime, and no other industry in the city, a city organization gets freely overtime. And in addition to that, you have over $10 million spent every year by the city out of its budget to handle police misconduct cases. So that's money that we could be putting to schools, to public housing, and et cetera. I'm sorry for taking so much space.
That was great. Thank you. While aggressive over-policing and police violence has been most directly aimed at poor and working class communities of color, especially black folk, poor white communities have also been victimized. Why should poor and working class white folk also care about this issue? And what's the potential for multiracial working class unity in the fight for major systemic reform / abolition?
I think people sometimes ask me this question in a slightly different way. They're like, well, you know, how do we, you know, like, what's the wedge issue that reaches those? And I think it's the war on drugs. Because a lot of white people are dying of drug overdoses and drug contamination and inadequate services. And this is happening disproportionately in poor white communities, and it is being addressed through policing and mass incarceration in Ohio, in Indiana, in West Virginia. People sometimes say, oh, well, now that it's fentanyl and it's affecting white people, everyone's talking about treatment and care. The discourse has shifted a little bit, but not the arrest rates. I mean, they're still locking up huge numbers of poor white people in middle America around drugs. And it's not saving any lives, just like it's not saving any lives in North Philadelphia. And so I think increasingly, and we've seen some stuff come out of these states, people are coming to this realization that policing, you know, ever tougher penalties on fentanyl and giving people the death penalty for trafficking, it doesn't work. And arresting it doesn't work. And we know what would work. Harm reduction strategies, some sort of system of legal safe supply, targeted economic development in communities so that people have a sense of hope, so that people don't turn to drug dealing as the only viable economic avenue for themselves. So I think really there's a lot of work that can be done around building cross-racial alliances around ending the war on drugs.
My good friend here is talking reality, okay, but unfortunately in post-reality United States, it's not that easy to deal with. And I think that even though that's absolutely true, I don't think the poor white community is going to identify with the poor black community. I think what they see and have seen since slavery times, because one of the eye-opening things I saw is in Georgia, for example, during slavery, 95% of slaves was owned by like 3% of the white people. So you would say, well, why did the poor whites support it? And they did because they could have a slave, even though they couldn't afford one, which gave them a class up. It gave them a false sense of being better. And I still think, even though the poor blacks and the poor whites are suffering from Oxycontin and fentanyl, all those things, it's going to be a difficult task to say, hey, we're together on this, because cynically politicians have separated them and exploited it, and then use that in order to maintain power. So you're absolutely right in a real world, and unfortunately, I don't know if we live there anymore.
But let me just point out that, you know, we have examples, though, of people who've made headway, right? Fred Hampton made a very conscious effort in this direction and found a receptive audience in some of these poor, rural, white, working class areas. So I would not shut the door on the possibility here. Yeah, that's right. I hope you're right.
I say that we leave the door open and we try and do the work, but the reality is that white supremacy exists even in poor white people, right? And here's the reality, you know, a white person formerly, and I'm a person in recovery, I have 29 years in recovery. The difference is, you know, a poor white person in a rural community can get clean and get their life together and easily find a job, as opposed to a black person in the hood get clean and still have difficulty finding their job. And typically because they have felonies, right? But I think we can't not have the conversation to build alliances, because first of all, there's power in numbers, right? And if we are able to lift our voices collectively, then we have more of a chance of fixing this problem.
Menika, do you have anything you want to add?
You have people who are unhoused, you have people living in food deserts and housing scarcity. And here's the thing, my analogy is, if you take a group of rats and put them in a cage and deprive them of food and water, they're going to start eating each other, right? So this is a situation that has been created, and the police maintain that situation. Then let's not even forget, and on top of that, gentrification, right? Because here's the thing, even when we talk about group violence and communities beefing against, you know, groups beefing against one another, well, before there was space in between them. Right? But then when they're pushed out of their country, out of their communities by gentrification, they're pushed on top of one another, and then gun violence rises. And then you need to bring the police in, right, to patrol that community and to make them under siege. And that's not the solution. What we need to do is we need social, racial, economic justice. We need for people to get their very basic needs met. We need to reinvest in our schools. We need to reinvest in communities that have been devastated by poverty and by gun violence. We need to reinvest in the people who need us the most.
One of the things that's been really frustrating, angering for me is seeing how we have these leaders who are putting themselves on the line, and then if a particular group posts in support of freeing Palestine, you see a bunch of white folks say, well, I supported Black Lives Matter in 2020 because you posted this, I'm not supporting you anymore. And they pull their support. And so it's just some, you know, I don't know, you brought that up, it reminded me of that. It's something that I've been watching. And I think it's just important to just kind of put out there that that's a thing that we do, and so that we can keep ourselves in check and not do that, and realize that, you know, the people that are leading these movements have a whole lot of experience leading these movements and know what they're talking about. And even if we disagree on certain things, that could be an opportunity to learn. It might be a place where maybe we disagree, but it doesn't mean I'm going to pull my support from these liberation movements. So I wanted to add that.
Thank you.